Thank you everybody for coming this evening, and welcome to our event on structuring your startup for growth and success. My name is Lainey Bennett. I am the head of content for LegalVision, and I'd like to start just with a brief acknowledgement of country and pay our respect to the past, present and emerging traditional custodians and elders of this nation, in particular the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land our headquarters is situated this evening. So, tonight I am joined by two of our expert lawyers. I have to my left David Kerr, who is a practice group leader for the corporate team. And David has assisted many startups and established companies with their legal needs, including advising on business contracts, employment contractor agreements, employee equity plans, leases, licenses agreements, and much, much more. And I'd also like to welcome Helen Young, who is LegalVision's tax practice leader with over 10 years of experience as a corporate tax lawyer. And she has expertise in tax-effective structures for corporations and startups, SMEs and individuals with high net wealth. So before we get into things, I just wanted to say, I've been watching the Olympics. I know they're over. Did you have a favourite moment at all in the event?
Yeah, I watched the Olympics, probably a little bit too much maybe, but Saya Sakikara's gold medal win, I guess the backstory of what happened to her brother and then how she took up the sport and injured herself but still came back and won. I was saying as it happened, I'm sure that somebody will make a movie about that story one day. The story just seems too unrealistic to be true. It is. So for me, that was the highlight moment for me.
The BMX, wasn't it? What about you, Helen?
I didn't actually watch the Olympics, but I watched snippets of little things on YouTube, and I did like the speed climbing. Like, that's amazing, how quickly someone can climb up a wall. So I saw a bit of that, but I didn't really follow it. And I saw the memes on the Turkish gunman, so I think all of you saw that. He was pretty cool. But yeah, no, I didn't really follow the Olympics.
Fair enough. I actually thought the Australian women did brilliantly. 13 out of the 18 golds were Australian female athletes, so go ladies. All right, so tonight, I've already done the introduction, so I'll move on. We're going to be talking about the best structures for startup for growth. And in addition to that, we're going to talk about why the right structure is important and the essential ESIC, Early-Stage Investment Concessions, what documentation you need, and planning for a future exit from the business. We're going to share tips and tricks, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions afterwards, and of course to continue your socialising and networking, and you can even chat with our experts afterwards as well this evening. So, without further ado, David, let's start with you. Choosing the right structure. So, company structure is really, really important, and the most common structure recommended for startups is the corporate structure. Why is that, and what are the benefits?
Thanks, Lainey. Yeah, look, the company structure is predominantly the structure we recommend, mostly because it's the most flexible and it achieves the most of the attributes that startups are usually looking for. So with the company structure, it enables you to take on investment, it allows you to remove your personal risk through the limitation of liability, it allows you to structure governance between directors and shareholders, it allows you to have different parts of your company group. It allows you to do all the elements of running a business in both the most operationally effective way and also risk mitigation way, and it allows you to structure for investment and exit. So it's usually the structure we recommend. Like everything, there's always some exceptions, but it is predominantly the structure of choice for startups.
Helen, what about from a tax perspective? What are the benefits of the corporate structure?
Thanks, Lainey. Yes, tax is something that really needs to be considered as part of your initial establishment when you're starting a business. And some of the key things that are beneficial in a corporate structure is the ability to retain monies. So as a business, you want the ability to hold the money that you're making if there's profits and then use it in running your business. If you're looking at a trust structure, it doesn't give you that opportunity. So that's one of the benefits in a corporate structure. The other one is franking credits. Some of you may already know the benefits of franking credits, but essentially you're not being taxed, or you are being taxed on the way out, but you have the ability to reduce the amount you're being taxed as a shareholder. The other benefit was also the corporate tax rate. So obviously having a lower tax rate in your business is going to be another way to grow your business. Instead of paying the money to the ATO, you're retaining the money for your business. So those are some of the key kind of tax considerations for a corporate structure.
Thank you. So I just noticed a lot of people up the back. There are a few chairs here available if you want to come and sit down, or stools on the side, and we can bring in some more chairs from across the back there if you want. All right, I'll let you sit down if you want to. Okay, so is it really important to set up a company structure at the beginning, or can you do it later? What are the pros and cons of both approaches, David?
Yeah, look, there's some elements of a corporate structure that are really important, I guess, to have in place from the beginning. The initial company needs to be set up for a corporate entity to gain the benefits from day one. It is important to look a little bit further than right now in terms of what your plans are. Maybe at day one, a single company, which you'll start to develop some IP and assets in, and you won't be trading straight away, might be fine with the ability to add companies later on. But you also want to think about your ownership of that company. So as you do start to develop IP, if you're an IP-based company, or you start to acquire assets in that company, if you have set it up holding in your personal name and you later want to take advantage of the tax benefits of having a family trust, the consequences later on might be negative on you for your ability to move it. So it is one of the steps that you do want to consider quite early on. But I guess the number one takeaway with a company structure is if it's set up with thought in the beginning, then it is quite flexible, and you can add to that structure and make it more complicated as your business gets more complicated. It's just knowing what level of complication is the minimum you can take at the start to reduce burden, both administratively and costs, but setting it up with that long-term view in place at the front.
Just to add to that, like David mentioned flexibility. I definitely agree that having a structure that allows for flexibility is the way to go. Something that I advise clients generally when we have those kind of initial conversations is, what are your long-term goals? What are you actually trying to do? How complicated do we need to make this right now? Can we simplify it and have a very simple but flexible structure that you can, add to, like David was saying, at a later time? I actually just spoke to a client recently who has really big goals, really great, wants to go overseas, wants to go into 5 different businesses, wants to do everything. And he wants to set up all these companies now. He wants to set up in the US, UK, and like 5 subsidiaries in Australia. But he hasn't done anything yet. So do we need to set up all these entities? Do we need to overcomplicate it now? Or can we keep it really simple, start off with two companies, and have the ability to bring the additional companies in later? So those are kind of things that you need to start thinking about when you're having these initial conversations is, do you need to overcomplicate it? Can you have a structure right at the beginning that gives you the flexibility to grow?
Thank you. Now, surely this structure is important to attracting investors as well. How does the corporate structure, in fact, help to attract investors as such? David, would you mind starting?
Yeah, look, the company structure structure as a sort of as an entity in itself is attractive to investors for a few reasons. One is it's a company, if it's a company limited by shares, is easily divisible into ownership. So you can make an investment for a part ownership of the company, whether you have a complex corporate group or you have a single company structure. The company itself is really akin to investment. Now, unit trusts, you might say, you could also take investment, but unit trusts are completely contractual relationships. So the benefit of companies is there is protections under the Corporations Act for investors. There is a level of regulation of companies that is protected at law, and it's more familiar in terms of security for investors. So a lot of investors will prefer the company structure because of those added legislative protections. But all the things you can do in a trust from an investor's point of view, you can do in a company. So you can separate how the company is run, you can separate share classes, you can give different people different rights. Everything that you can dream of to attract an investor to invest in your business is possible through a company structure, and there is little, if any, downside of using that structure from an investment point of view.
Can I just want to add in, just from a tax perspective, for investors looking to invest into a particular structure, some of you may have already heard of Early-Stage Innovative Concession. It's only available to a company, so that is one of the important reasons for an investor. If they're investing into a structure, if you have a unit trust structure, it doesn't have that benefit. I'm going to talk about ESIC a bit later on, so that's just wanted to add on that. ESIC is a very good reason why you want to set up a corporate structure for your investors.
Presumably corporate governance is important as well. Is that attractive to investors by having that structure?
Yeah, that's right. So as I was sort of alluding to before, with corporate governance, you can have the contractual corporate governance through your shareholders agreement. If you're a trust, then you would have it through your trust deed or your unit holders agreement, or however you want to do it. But with companies, you get the added protection or the added regulation of the Corporations Act. So there's certain provisions that the parties can't contract out of, and there are minimum requirements that are set and governed, so that if investors and foreign investors who may not be familiar with the Australian landscape, the comfort of investing in a company, because it's somewhat regulated and more familiar to them, will always be higher than, say, a trust, which doesn't even exist in some jurisdictions. So the corporate structure is much more regulated and much more familiar from a global scale.
Thank you. So what about the role of structure in terms of scaling up? How does this structure influence your ability to grow and expand down the track?
Yeah, look, structuring for growth is really important because as your business grows, it gets more complicated, and usually with complication comes risk. So one of the main reasons why companies are beneficial at an early stage is, as an individual, you could set up a company or you could set up a business that you own, but all the contracts you enter into in your personal name, and if things go wrong, you're personally liable. So there is no limitation of risk, it's all on you. If you set up a company, it is a new person. Now, a business will take on different sorts of risks, and the more complicated the business, the more varying the risk is. Now, usually you want to keep your assets away from your liabilities, not just on your profit and loss on your balance sheet, but also in a legal point of view. If you can have your contracts in an operating company and you have your IP and your cash in the holding company, to the extent that there is no cross guarantee, then your branding, your IP and your physical assets could still survive a bad outcome in terms of the trading business. That also takes into account as you do different things. If we were an example, like you're a company that manufactures products, you also sell them to end users, and you might also have a service division that goes and services them. The manufacturing entity is going to be carrying a lot more risk than the other two entities. So do you want that high burden of risk to be muddied in with the other businesses? Because if manufacturing became too risky, you could contract out the manufacturing and just become a sales and servicing company that is lower risk. If that's all in one entity, then your ability to mitigate that risk and survive a catastrophic manufacturing issue will be limited if you don't plan out your structure. So your ability to grow and survive a bad decision will be really limited if you don't plan out your structure.
Helen, do you have anything to add from the perspective of overseas, expanding overseas in terms of scaling up?
Yeah, so I mean, we get a lot of clients that want to expand overseas, and thinking about what type of structure at the beginning may give them the flexibility to do that. You know, as we've alluded to, having that flexible structure at the beginning allows you to have that growth to move overseas. We do get a lot of clients that they already have an existing structure, and they want to then flip all their shareholders up to a different jurisdiction as a way to expand or bring on investors from a different country. That ability to do that is generally only available from a tax perspective for a company, because there are certain concessions available for these types of flip-ups or moving into a different jurisdiction. So I think when you're setting up a structure and you're thinking about going overseas, having a structure that gives you that flexibility is really key. I mean, I guess we're talking about the same thing as always, just thinking ahead of, you know, what are you trying to do, planning ahead, and also having a structure that's flexible.
Excellent, thank you. How about we get into some examples now? So what would happen if you have a poorly chosen structure? I'm sure you've seen some issues with that from clients in terms of hindering growth and investment opportunities. Helen, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Lainey. Yes, we have seen a lot of poorly structured structures, and they are sometimes very frustrating, not only for us as advisors, but also for the clients, because they thought they were getting the right advice at the beginning, paid a lot of money, and now they have to restructure or pay a lot of money to get out of a very poorly structured group. We've had a client actually who they didn't get advice at the beginning, and by the time it came to us, it was scatters of companies altogether, but they weren't all joined, but in very random proportions of shares. They wanted to sell, and they had problems with buyers wanting to actually buy their business because the structure just looked terrible, and it was very difficult to understand where the business was or where the value was sitting. So that actually resulted in them not being able to sell their business, and they had to wait another year, and they actually lost. They had to reduce the purchase price a year later significantly, which, you know, isn't great, and then also pay a lot of fees from a legal perspective to restructure before the sale. So it just ultimately this person had to pay a lot of money. It delayed everything, and they also lost on a very good, you know, sale price. So that's one we saw. It kind of goes back to just making sure you get advice at the beginning.
Yeah, look, there is always a lot of examples of poorly structured groups, and they're not always, I guess, advised. I think a lot of startups are in a position where, you know, money is finite, and the desire to act quickly is always quite high. We see it quite often in an investment point of view, where founders will often start working on a project to develop something, and they just had this company or they had this trust set up, and they start doing stuff in this entity and put some stuff there. Then they realise they get some advice of somebody else that having a company is really important, so they set up a new company, and that company starts getting contracts, and they get, you know, quite sophisticated and start doing this, and then all investors do some level of due diligence on your company, and then investors come in and say, so all this time you've been operating this business that doesn't actually own the IP that you're selling to people, it's over there in some other trust. If I invest you in your company, I have absolutely no control over that IP. It's not part of the group. What's the protection? Yes, I could give some money here and some money over there and take parts, but that's too complicated for me. I also don't like trusts. If there's 500 offers on my table and I'm taking the most attractive one, even if this is a really good business, I might take the one with less risk. So if you are a business who's looking to raise capital, getting these things right early can save you the inconvenience, so you're missing out on that money, or having, similar to the exit scenario, having to do a restructure, which in many cases not only costs you legal or accounting fees, but you may have to pay tax to the ATO on money you don't actually realise, because you're transferring an asset that that you've paid tax on, but you never received the cash for. So, there's a number of consequences of getting it wrong. Not to say that, as we said earlier, we're not trying to overcomplicate it from the start, but there is some things that we can, very, very relatively low cost and low inconvenience to get right at the start, which, and everyone always says it, but does stop you from coming into a problem later on down the track. So whether it's exit or investment, I think it is really important to at least consider that the very basic elements are there. Really complicated, and the risk mitigation structures I was talking about earlier, they can come later.
I just wanted to add a couple of examples that just came to mind as David was speaking. We've had, this has actually happened quite a few times, is where founders start creating and spending money on a particular R&D project, spending a lot of money thinking they could make the claim under the R&D tax concession, not realising that the R&D claim can only be made in a company. So they come to us and they think they're already operating a company, unaware that as themselves as a sole trader is not a company, and then trying to claim the R&D, and they don't get it. So there's a lot of money that they've lost out on because they didn't get advice at the beginning. And it can be a very simple conversation with someone, with your accountant or your tax advisors, to ensure that you're in the appropriate structure before you start spending money. And the other example I just really quickly wanted to raise is that some people set up a company and a trust. The company is maybe acting as a corporate trustee for that trust, and they're also operating out of that corporate trustee, and they think it's operating out of the corporate trustee, but actually is in the trust. So it adds complications as to who actually owns the IP or the asset, or who can claim R&D, and also if you need to restructure. So it just adds complications. So it's understanding your structure, understanding what you're setting up, and again, going back to getting advice at the beginning.
All right, Helen, I'm going to stay with you. And you mentioned ESICs before. So can you please explain what they are and why they are important for a startup to consider?
Yes, so ESIC is it's called an early-stage innovative concession. It's available to investors that are investing into an early-stage company. So an early-stage company is a company that's less than 3 years old, or 6 years, with less than $1 million of expenditure in the last year. The benefit for the investor is that they get a 20% tax offset in that particular year on their income, and also a CGT modification on the shares that they hold. So for 10 years. So if the shares increase in value over 10 years' time, and they dispose of the shares in, say, year 9, and the shares have gone up in value in $10 million, then there's no tax payable. So it's a significant concession for investors, and a lot of investors do want to be able to participate in that concession. So being able to offer that to your investors is a huge advantage if you are an early stage investor and you need the funding, and that particular investor is looking at a number of different startups they're looking to invest. They may more than likely choose you because you have the ability to be an early stage innovative company. But there are certain, it's important you're getting that structure right. Actually, I think it's one of your questions a bit later, but I might talk about that now as an example, because we see companies that set up a parent company and an operating company, and the company itself doesn't have the right documentations in place, or they're not consolidated for income tax purposes. The reason why, and that can be a huge detriment to the ESIC concession, because under the early stage innovative concession, the company that's issuing the shares has to be the company that's also the innovative company. It has to be doing innovative activities. Now that can either be tied to the R&D work that's being conducted, or there's particular activities that it's undertaking that needs to be met by a certain test. If you're operating a company and that group is the one that's undertaking all those activities, but your head company is the one that's issuing the shares, then the entity that's actually the early stage company is the head company that's issued the shares. But if it's not undertaking the activities, then you've got a problem. You're not actually the early stage innovative company, because that company doesn't do any innovative work. So if you don't meet that, you don't get the concessions, your investors are not going to be very happy. It's really important that you either consolidate for income tax purposes, so the group itself is treated as a one taxpayer for tax purposes, or you put in place a services agreement between the head company and the operating company. These little things can make a huge difference, and it actually was the facts to a recent tribunal case. It's the first ESIC case that's come out in Australia, and in that particular case, the company was a head co and an operating co, and the group wasn't consolidated, and there was no documentation between the two companies. So the operating company tried to claim ESIC, but it was actually the head co. So the investors lost out on its concession, and it went all the way to the tribunal. So it's really important. That's what I'm trying to say, is just making sure you get the right advice at the beginning. And if you are wanting to grow, bring on investors, ESIC is a really great incentive.
Excellent. Let's change direction a little bit now. Thank you for that, Helen. And David, what about the documentation? What are the essential documents that you are required to support your structure, your chosen structure?
Yeah, thanks, Lainey. Documentation, it's probably the founder's nightmare. Wants to do what they can, avoid having to document everything. But I guess a lot of businesses are started where it's not just one person setting up a company to do what they want as the supreme ruler of that company. They're usually done in tandem. There's investors involved, or there's co-founders. There's lots of people involved, and very early on, usually everyone's really aligned and all pulling in the same direction. And we tend to hear people say, "It's all good. We'll sort that out later." But the point that comes later is once somebody has moved in a different direction and everybody's no longer once everybody isn't getting along, the chances of agreeing a mechanism or a document that would help resolve that issue is quite low. So I guess it's very good. So it's really important from, I guess, a company structure level, if you're not running that business by yourself, to have a shareholders agreement. Not because we're ever planning for things to go wrong, but it sets up the expectations of everybody. You get an opportunity to negotiate that document whilst everybody is aligned, and we hope that everybody always stays aligned. But there's many things that happen in the shareholders agreement that are really important, whether it's documenting who's responsible for what, whether it sets out how many of us have to agree before it's time to exit, whether it's, who can make a call on how much capital we give away in a capital raise, whether it's on, what constitutes somebody having abandoned the project and no longer deserves to be a part of it. So it's probably one of the most essential documents where you are going into business with other people. The other ones are really, I guess, founders often put money into companies. They don't document it. Was it paid up capital? Was it a loan? Not quite sure. Do you ever expect that money back if you never documented it? An investor comes along and says, well, I just invested money in, if that was meant to be a loan, you should have told me. I didn't see any loan document, so don't think you're paying yourself back with my money. There is conversations like that make it really difficult, where you didn't document it and, it was just sitting on the balance sheet wherever my accountant told me to put it, but I didn't really think about what I wanted to do with it. So a lot of the internal documents, whether it's between companies or whether it's between founders and companies, that includes how they're engaged with the company. Those things are often overlooked, but once it does come to investment or growth or exit, one thing I always look to say is, at some point in time, whether that's investment or exit, somebody else who's not friendly to you is going to be looking at your corporate housekeeping and taking a view on your business based on your prior conduct. So the more that you have in place that's clear, in an environment where we're trying to drive up valuations of company for the purpose of not giving away too much equity on a raise or on exit, getting as much as we can, you don't want to give anyone an excuse to drive the price down or say this is particularly risky, so I'm going to give you less favourable terms in the contract. Anything you can do, as much as it sounds hard at the start, to avoid that conversation later and give everybody confidence that you're running a very sophisticated operation and everything is in order and there's no reason for them to doubt it, really does help with all those conversations. It's, you know, the power of 1% gains, but if you do all those little 1%ers right along the way, you don't have to scramble at the end trying to pull them all together and reconstruct the past.
Thank you. And without commenting further, I'll just add IP protection as well. You know, if you want to have your IP documentation in place so that you can prove who owns the IP during a due diligence and so forth down the track. We need to keep moving forward. So let's talk about the importance of documents for, so you talked about the importance of documents for exits. How does the structure impact your future exit? Have we covered that off yet? You covered that off? Okay, all right. All right, so, and have we talked about, do you think, enough about the planning for exiting the business in the future? Is there anything you want to cover from a tax perspective? Or Helen?
You want to go, David? I mean, look, structure, like I said at the beginning, tax is something you have to consider in pretty much everything you do, and that includes an exit, probably in particular an exit. And having the right structure is going to dictate what concessions you can actually access on an exit, and also thinking about when you're going to exit and where you're holding certain assets, so whether you're going to sit it in your operating company or your holding company, and then where the taxing event's going to be. So going back to, you know, what type of concessions are available for what type of entity, we did mention a trust structure. So generally the two types of structures that people think about is a trust or a company, and a lot of accountants really push for a trust, and the reason why is because there are flexibilities in distributions, but you can't retain money in a trust, so you have to distribute it. But then the benefit is that the trust automatically gets a 50% CGT discount on a disposal of an asset if the asset's been held for more than 12 months. So that's a huge advantage for a trust, which is why accountants do push for it. However, a company doesn't. So a company doesn't get the discount automatically. There are other concessions available to discount any capital gains tax. So thinking about if there is an exit, planning ahead on what your structure looks like, where you're actually putting your assets is really important. So if you are thinking of an exit, you should have those conversations with your accountant or your tax advisors.
All right, so we're just going to wrap up with a few key takeaways from this evening's points. I don't know if you can see them from there, but so what are your goals? So make sure that whether you've got short-term or long-term plans, such as expanding overseas or preparing for an exit, your plans will influence the advice you receive on choosing the right structure. Selecting the right structure provides flexibility and allows you to pivot and expand, especially internationally. Also make your business more attractive for future investors. Seek expert advice to determine if your company qualifies as an ESIC, and ensure that your business structures align with the investor's goals to access the ESIC incentives. Ensure you have all the appropriate internal legal documentation for investor due diligence and future exits and tax purposes. And of course, something that's been emphasized repeatedly is get the right advice early in order to achieve your goals. So, just before we open the floor up to questions, I've lost a little E. I just want to mention that we have a couple more startup events coming in October that you might be interested in. We haven't got the registration pages up for them yet. I just wanted to let you know that they are coming. Startup, legal essentials, getting your business off the ground, and the power of branding, building and protecting your brand. And that one will be done with IP Australia as well. And I'm going to just hand over for a minute to my colleague Danu, who's going to very briefly tell you about our membership model.
Thank you. Hey everyone, my name's Danu, as Lainey has said, and David and Helen have given us some very helpful things to think about in terms of putting the right structure in place and working towards setting up your business for success. But we know that there's actually quite a few things on your mind at the moment, and you're thinking through, how am I engaging with other businesses? How am I setting up my brand and protecting that? and how am I going to grow my team? And so one of the reasons we designed this membership is so that we can give you access to multiple lawyers across various different areas and give you essentially the same advice that you'd get if you were going to multiple lawyers, but all in the one place. So it's essentially replacing your in-house lawyer. And as a member, you get access to over 100 specialist lawyers who will be able to draft your contracts, review them, amend them, give you unlimited legal advice consultations, so anytime you have a question, as well as unlimited trademark applications in Australia and New Zealand. So I know that a lot of you, just in speaking to you this evening, may be preparing for a launch, or maybe you've recently launched, or you've been operating for a while. And so how you use the membership really depends on what stage of the business you're at, and as David and Helen said, what your ultimate goals are. And so what I would recommend is booking a consultation with us. Tell us your plans, tell us what you're working towards, and that way we can actually put in place an idea of how you'd use the membership, but more importantly, what are the things that you need to consider over the next few months, and if not longer. Even if you're a little bit way off from launching, it's still worth just finding that out and seeing if you want to DIY, but ultimately just working through how would it work for you, and what can you do with it. So you can use is there a QR code? So there's a QR code, so if you want to book a consultation. Otherwise, you'll receive an email tomorrow, both with the recording of tonight, as well as a survey, and you'll be able to book a consultation there. There's also a few of us around here tonight who, if you just want to chat more broadly about the membership, happy to chat. Otherwise, consultation is probably the best way to go find out more.
So thank you so much, Daniel. We're going to open the floor to questions. Daniel will take the microphone around. Would anyone like to put their hand up and ask a question? Wow. Oh, yes, down here. Thank you.
My name is Yin Tang, and actually I am a business owner, startup, and now grow into a couple of companies. I just want to know that I've been seeing my accountants doing all this, like the trust, the company, the corporation. So you guys are lawyers, right? So in terms of moving forward for the company, does it mean that what the advice you added to the accountant, what's the difference? Like who I'm listening to, or do I listen to both?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes it's confusing, like who do you go for particular things, especially when there's an overlap. And it really depends. If you've already got an existing accountant, and that accountant is a business advisory accountant, then I would recommend that you stay with them to speak to them about your tax structure and sort of things that you need to do. However, there'll be a point where you'll need a lawyer to come in to draft your documentation, to actually affect and implement the advice that your accountant has given you. Sometimes, from my perspective as a tax lawyer, I work with accountants on a daily basis, and we generally work together on a holistic basis because the accountants would generally have the accounting knowledge and background, but we would overlap it with any particular bespoke things that the accountants are not aware of, even if they are business advisors. So we would generally work together. Some accountants have particular expertise, so they might be an R&D specialist accountant, or they might be an accountant that is only doing your tax returns or doing your BASs, and therefore may not have advisory experience, and that is okay. So we would be more involved in those kind of arrangements. It's really important we are working together with all your advisors to give you a better advice. Does that help?
Can I just add that the lawyers would also be able to help you with your documentation around structure and all your corporate documentation, your employment, if you've got employment contracts, supplier contracts, all of the stuff that you might be doing from that perspective, capital raising, that sort of thing as well, which is all part of LegalVision. Yeah,
so your accountant won't be able to do those things. They won't be able to prepare legal documentation. They're not lawyers. So they can definitely give you tax advice, but like I said, to actually implement, you need to bring in the lawyers. And like Lainey said, the company and corporations, We generally would do them as part of, and it's under your membership, so you don't pay anything extra other than the government fees. But we generally do it because if we're giving the advice on the structure, then we would want to implement the companies to ensure that we're putting the right shareholding in, the right share price and things like that. So I recommend that you come to LegalVision to do it rather than get your accountant to do it if they're not giving you the structure advice. Yeah.
It sounds like for ESIC, it sounds like a very powerful tool for early stage investors. I'm just wondering how big of a deal breaker it is for startups for them to say no, or how powerful is it for ESIC to be used for early stage startups? I'm just curious, if say I'm a startup and I'm not eligible for ESIC, is that like a massive like a shackle for me to not be able to apply for that?
I think from an investor point of view, it's always important to remember every investor has a different mandate. They have different financial conditions. You hear about all the times that investors said no to people like Canberra and safety culture and things like that, and they probably wish they didn't. So, if an investor is not necessarily attracted to your company, it's probably not on ESIC alone, unless there's somebody who is trying to make investments to take advantage of a tax benefit right now. Usually with investors, if they're VCs, they might have other benefits they're entitled to as well, depending on their structure. But I guess it is a competitive market investment, and the way that we usually talk to clients about this is if everybody's lined up in a row and you're ESIC eligible and they're not, and there's a defining point of who do I go with, they're all great companies, it's not going to harm you to ensure you have it. So I guess it's not fatal. It doesn't mean you can never take on investment. Maybe some investors will say I only invest, but it is a differentiating point. And if you've done something to make yourself ineligible that you could have avoided, it would be really disappointing to miss out on that investment because of a slight mistake. Whereas if you have put the things in place that probably no more inconvenience to you, and they still said no, well, no harm, no foul.
In terms of just fees and things like that, like for someone that has no idea what company structure, what to expect, what it looks like financially for them in the beginning stages of the journey.
So if you're talking about being a LegalVision member, then the only fees of a company is the government fee, which is about $452 to set up. You have to pay ASIC. Every year there's a renewal fee for a company. ASIC charge you about $250. Those are the mandatory fees. Outside of that, there is no other costs for having a company. There is operating costs, there's accounting fees, there is those fees, but to the extent that you have the skills to do your own BAS, or you can run a company quite cheaply. But it really depends on how complex your business is and whether you can do those things yourself. A trust, though, or any other structure, even a sole trader, you still have to do tax returns. There might not be an initial upfront cost. Trusts, New South Wales, the stamp duty fee is much higher than the ASIC fee. So yes, it's $750 now. Yes, you won't have an ongoing renewal one if you don't use a corporate trustee, but usually those compliance costs of having a company are really minimised by the benefits you get from having the company structure. If you have a sole trader because you want to avoid $500 and do one bad contract, the consequences of having to make good the damage that you caused is going to be quickly eaten up by a $500 fee.
With this early stage investor thing, does the company have to be getting R&D grants first or not?
You don't have to be. So to be an early stage, you have to be an early stage company, which is the 3 years I was talking about. And then you have to meet either a 100 points test, which...
What's that?
So there's basically a list of things that you can do, one of them is R&D, and you get 75 points if you're an R&D entity. So you can go down that path, and if you meet the 100 points test, it's easy. You just go through the list and see how many points you can get. If you have R&D, it meets 75, so you're nearly there. The other test, if you're not an R&D entity, is you look to the principles-based test. There are 5 elements of the principles-based test, which basically looks to, what are your business plans, what are the activities you've undertaken, the expenses you've incurred, what are your plans on scaling and growth, and it basically looks at all those 5 elements, and if you meet the principles-based test, then you don't need to be an R&D. So that's one. There's 2 tests. There's 100 points or principles-based. If you meet one, then you meet the ESIC test. The R&D is only relevant to the 100 points test.
Okay.
Right, do we have any other questions? Great, all right. Well, listen, thank you everyone for joining us, and please stick around, have a drink, have something to eat and network, and have a chat with us if you'd like to as well. Thank you.